Picture this, it's late May 1940, over 400,000. Allied soldiers are trapped on the beaches of a small French port town. Behind them, the relentless German war machine closes in. Before them, the cold waters of the English Channel stretch endlessly toward home. They have nowhere to run, no way to escape, and according to every military strategist, no hope of survival. But what happened next would defy all expectations. What happened next would be called the miracle of Dunkirk. To understand the miracle, we first need to understand the catastrophe that made it necessary. September 1st, 1939. Germany invades Poland and the world is plunged into war. Britain and France declare war on Nazi Germany, sending their armies to the continent. The British Expeditionary Force, or BF, crosses the Channel with confidence. They're professional soldiers, well-trained and ready to stop Hitler's aggression. But they're not ready for what's coming. For months, nothing happens. The French and British face the Germans along the border defenses in what becomes known as the phony war. Both sides wait. Both sides prepare. It's the calm before an unprecedented storm. Then, on May 10th, 1940, everything changes. Two massive German armies surge westward in a devastating blitzkrieg attack. This isn't the trench warfare of World War I. This is something entirely new, entirely terrifying. Panzer tanks roll through Belgium and the Low Countries with shocking speed. The German strategy is brilliant and brutal. Bypass the heavily fortified Maginot Line and strike through the supposedly impassable Ardennes forest. The Allies are caught completely off guard. Within days, German armored divisions race toward the English Channel, cutting Allied forces in two like a knife through butter. The British Expeditionary Force, along with French and Belgian troops, suddenly finds itself in a deadly trap. German forces are to their south, cutting them off from the rest of France. To the north and west, the advancing Wehrmacht closes in relentlessly, and to the east, the cold waters of the Channel. By May 19th, just 9 days after the German offensive began, British commanders face a horrifying reality. Their entire army might be annihilated on foreign soil. General Harold Alexander later recalled the desperate situation. They were surrounded, outgunned, and running out of options. When British General Lord Gort met with French General Billet, he learned something chilling. There were no French troops between the German advance and the sea. The path to total disaster lay wide open. Gort made a critical decision. Evacuation wasn't just an option anymore, it was the only option. He turned his attention to Dunkirk, a small French seaport town about 10 kilometers from the Belgian border. It wasn't an obvious choice, but it had crucial advantages: old fortifications, some defensive capability, and most importantly, the longest sand beach in Europe where large groups of men could potentially assemble. On May 20th, even before officially informing the French allies, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill suggested something unprecedented. The Admiralty should begin preparing every available small vessel to cross the Channel to France. The clock was ticking, and behind the Allied lines, over 400,000 men waited, not yet knowing if rescue would come or if they'd become prisoners or corpses. In the white cliffs of Dover, deep beneath Dover Castle, a room that once housed an electrical generator, a dynamo, became the nerve center of what would be the largest military evacuation in history. Admiral Bertram Ramsay was recalled from retirement to mastermind this impossible mission. Working from this underground command post carved into the chalk cliffs, he and his staff began planning Operation Dynamo. The name came from the room itself, but it would come to symbolize something far greater, the driving force that would save an army. Captain William Tennant was given tactical command as Beachmaster, the man who would organize the evacuation from the beaches themselves. When Tennant arrived at Dunkirk on May 27th, his heart must have sunk. Luftwaffe bombing raids had destroyed the port facilities. The main docks were unusable, and the beaches? They presented an almost impossible challenge. You see, Dunkirk's beaches slope gently into the sea. Even at high tide, large Royal Navy destroyers couldn't get within a mile of the shore without running aground. The shallow waters meant that soldiers would need to wade out through the surf, hoping to reach small boats that could ferry them to larger ships waiting in deeper water. It was going to be painfully, impossibly slow. Initial projections were grim. Military planners thought they might, If everything went perfectly, rescue perhaps 45,000 men over 2 days before the Germans overran the position. The first day of Operation Dynamo, May 26th, seemed to confirm their worst fears. Only 8,000 soldiers made it off the beaches. At that rate, hundreds of thousands would be left behind. But then Captain Tennant noticed something: the East Mole, a narrow breakwater extending into deeper water. It was 1,400 yards long, topped with a wooden walkway just wide enough for troops to march 4 abreast. It was never designed as a dock. It was meant to protect the harbor from waves, but desperate times called for desperate measures. Tennant made a bold decision: use the East Mole as an improvised pier. It worked. Ships could pull alongside and take on troops directly. This single innovation would prove crucial. Eventually, approximately 200,000 soldiers would board rescue ships from this unlikely platform. Meanwhile, back in England, an extraordinary call went out. The British Admiralty sent an appeal to boat owners throughout southern England. Any vessel that could float, any craft that could make the Channel crossing, was needed. And the response? Unprecedented. Fishing boats, pleasure yachts, river ferries, lifeboats, private sailboats, even paddle steamers usually used for leisure cruises on the Thames. Over 800 vessels of all shapes and sizes answered the call, everything from Royal Navy destroyers to tiny civilian craft that had never ventured beyond calm rivers. These became known as the little ships of Dunkirk. Many were crewed by civilians, fishermen, yacht owners, weekend sailors, ordinary people volunteering to sail into a war zone. They would ferry soldiers from the shallow beaches out to the larger warships waiting offshore, making trip after dangerous trip under fire. The evacuation began to pick up speed, but it faced a terrifying enemy from above. Reichsmarshal Hermann Göring, commander of the German Luftwaffe, made a bold promise to Hitler. His air force would destroy the trapped Allied armies. Naval evacuation? It would be impossible under the weight of German bombs. And he nearly made good on that promise. Starting on May 27th, the Luftwaffe launched wave after wave of attacks. 300 German bombers, protected by 550 fighter sorties, descended on Dunkirk in 12 devastating raids. They dropped 15,000 high-explosive bombs and 30,000 incendiary bombs on the port. The carnage was unimaginable. Stuka dive bombers, those infamous aircraft with the terrifying sirens, screamed down from the sky, sinking ships with horrifying precision. The troopship Kate d'Azur went down. The steamer Aden, 8,000 tons, was sent to the bottom. Oil tanks erupted in massive fireballs, sending thick black smoke thousands of feet into the air. On the beaches, soldiers had nowhere to hide. They dug into the sand, pressed themselves flat, and prayed as bombs exploded around them, sending up geysers of sand and body parts. The harbor was wrecked. Ships burned. The sea itself seemed to be on fire from spilled oil. But something unexpected happened. The Royal Air Force, flying from bases in England, threw everything they had into the battle. 16 squadrons of RAF fighters took to the skies to protect the evacuation. They were outnumbered, outgunned, but they fought with desperate determination. Spitfires and Hurricanes engaged German bombers and fighters in furious dogfights over the beaches. On May 27th alone, RAF pilots claimed 38 kills while losing 14 of their own aircraft. The battle in the skies was brutal. German bomber squadrons suffered heavy casualties. Kampfgeschwader 2 and 3 took the worst losses, with 23 Dornier bombers shot down. The Luftwaffe discovered that air superiority wasn't as easy as Göring had promised. Over the 9 days of the evacuation, the RAF flew more than 3,500 sorties. They paid a heavy price: 177 aircraft lost and many pilots killed. But they succeeded in something crucial. They prevented the Luftwaffe from stopping the evacuation. Still, from the beaches, many soldiers never saw these aerial battles. The RAF fought further inland, over the evacuation corridor, often beyond the sight of the troops below. Some soldiers, bombed relentlessly on the beaches, bitterly asked, "Where is the RAF?" They were there, fighting and dying above the clouds. But weather played a role too, almost as if nature itself conspired to help. For the first several days, unusually calm seas made it possible for small boats to approach the beaches. Even more remarkably, the wind blew from the west, carrying thick smoke from burning oil refineries across the beaches like a curtain, obscuring the German view of the evacuating troops. Then, on May 29th, the wind shifted. The smoke cleared. The beaches lay exposed under clear skies. The Luftwaffe attacks that followed were so severe that evacuation could only continue at night. It became a race against time. Every hour of darkness was precious. Every ship that made it across was a victory. Here's where one of World War II's greatest mysteries enters our story. On May 24th, when German Panzer divisions were less than 15 miles from Dunkirk, racing to seal the trap completely, an order came down from the highest levels of command. Halt. Stop the advance. General Gerd von Rundstedt ordered the armor to stop. The Panzers, which had been unstoppable, sat idle while the British and French desperately tried to establish defensive positions around Dunkirk. Why? Historians have debated this for over 80 years. After the war, German generals blamed Hitler personally, suggesting the Führer made the decision. Some theories suggest Hitler believed the marshland around Dunkirk was unsuitable for tanks. Others argue that the Panzer divisions needed maintenance after their rapid advance. Some claim Hermann Göring convinced Hitler to let the Luftwaffe finish off the trapped armies, claiming the glory for the Air Force. The most controversial theory? That Hitler deliberately allowed the British to escape because he believed Britain would be more willing to negotiate peace if he showed clemency. That he wanted to preserve the British Empire as a potential future ally against the Soviet Union. Whatever the reason, the Halt Order gave the Allies precious time to establish defensive positions, time to bring up troops to hold a perimeter, and crucially, time to begin Operation Dynamo. The order was rescinded on May 26th, but by then, Allied defensive lines had hardened. British and French troops, including elements of the renowned 51st Highland Division, dug in around Dunkirk. They fought fierce rearguard actions, buying time with their lives. Every hour they held meant more men could be saved from the beaches. The Belgian army fought until it could fight no more, surrendering on May 28th, but the perimeter around Dunkirk held, shrinking each day but never breaking entirely. By the end of May, Operation Dynamo had found its rhythm, brutal, exhausting, but functioning. The scene on the beaches was something from a nightmare made real. Thousands upon thousands of soldiers stood in long queues stretching from the dunes into the surf. They waited, hour after hour, under periodic bombing and strafing runs. When aircraft appeared, they'd dive for cover, then reform the lines when the danger passed. Officers maintained discipline as best they could, but the strain showed on every face. These men had been fighting a losing battle for weeks. They'd marched for days with little food or sleep. They'd seen friends die. They'd abandoned equipment and positions. And now they stood, hoping that salvation would come from across the sea. The little ships made trip after dangerous trip. Small fishing boats that normally carried a few dozen fishermen now packed in 50, 60, 70 soldiers. They'd motor out to deeper water, transfer their human cargo to destroyers or larger vessels, then head back to the beaches for another load. Some civilian boat owners made 5, 10, even 15 trips across the channel. They dodged bombs, navigated through floating debris and bottas, and pushed their vessels to the limit. The HMS Medway Queen, a paddle steamer usually used for tourist cruises, made 7 trips to Dunkirk and rescued over 7,000 men. The 62-foot fishing boat Tamzine ferried men across and survived being bombed 3 times. On the larger ships, troops were packed so tightly they could barely move. Every available space decks, corridors, engine rooms filled with exhausted, often wounded soldiers. The scenes at Dover when the ships arrived moved hardened sailors to tears. Troops stumbled off ships, many barely able to walk. Local British citizens met them with tea, sandwiches, and blankets. Trains carried them to stations across southern England, where more volunteers offered food and comfort. The wounded were rushed to hospitals. The able-bodied were processed and sent to camps to rest and reorganize. Meanwhile, back at Dunkirk, the ordeal continued. French troops, which had initially been ordered to hold Dunkirk as a fortress, finally received permission to evacuate on May 28th. British forces were given priority in the early days. creating tension between the Allies, but eventually French soldiers began boarding ships in larger numbers. One heart-wrenching reality: many French soldiers evacuated to England would be sent back to France to continue fighting. When France surrendered on June 22, most of these men would be killed or captured. For them, Dunkirk was only a brief reprieve. As June began, the perimeter around Dunkirk continued to shrink. German artillery moved closer. The defensive positions grew harder to hold. On June 2, a message was sent from Captain Tennant to Admiral Ramsay at Dover: BEF evacuated. The bulk of British forces were safely across the Channel. But the evacuation wasn't over. Thousands of French soldiers still held positions, still fought to keep the corridor open. The last ships left Dunkirk on June 4 under heavy fire. When the operation finally ended, the numbers defied all predictions. Over 338,000 Allied soldiers evacuated. That's 338,000 men who military planners thought would be lost. The initial estimate had been to save perhaps 45,000 at best. Approximately 198,000 British troops rescued. Another 140,000 French and Belgian soldiers. Saved by 933 vessels of every description, from Royal Navy destroyers to tiny pleasure boats. The cost had been significant. 9 British destroyers sunk. Around 200 Allied ships and boats lost to bombs, torpedoes, or mines. The RAF lost 177 aircraft. Over 3,500 military personnel killed in the evacuation itself. And approximately 90,000 Allied troops were left behind, killed, or captured. The British Expeditionary Force made it home, but almost all their heavy equipment was left on the beaches of France. Tanks, artillery, trucks, supplies abandoned. It would take years to rebuild Britain's armored capability. And perhaps most tragic, the 51st Highland Division, fighting elsewhere in France under French command, was captured. Over 10,000 soldiers who couldn't reach Dunkirk became prisoners of war. On June 4, 1940, Winston Churchill stood before Parliament. His speech that day captured both the miracle and the hard reality of Dunkirk. We must be very careful not to assign to this deliverance the attributes of a victory. Wars are not won by evacuations. He was right, of course. Dunkirk was a massive defeat for the Allies. France would surrender to Germany just 18 days later. Britain now stood alone against Nazi Germany. But Churchill also recognized something profound. Operation Dynamo had saved Britain's only trained army. Without those 338,000 men, Britain would have been defenseless against invasion. The nation's capability to continue the war depended on those soldiers making it home. In the British public consciousness, Dunkirk became something else entirely: the miracle of Dunkirk. It created the Dunkirk spirit, a sense that even in the darkest hour, even facing impossible odds, the British could endure and prevail through determination and collective effort. That spirit would carry Britain through the dark months ahead, through the Battle of Britain, through the Blitz, through years of standing alone against Hitler's war machine. Hitler had called Dunkirk a decisive victory for Germany, and in military terms he was correct. But he'd failed to destroy the British army completely. Those soldiers who escaped would form the core of British forces that would fight in North Africa, in Italy, and eventually in the liberation of France itself. 4 years later, on D-Day, some of those same men who'd been evacuated from Dunkirk's beaches returned to French shores, this time to liberate, not to flee. The little ships became legendary. Many of them still exist, lovingly preserved and maintained. They re-allowed to fly a special flag, the Dunkirk Jacka privilege reserved only for vessels that participated in Operation Dynamo. Each year, some of these boats make the crossing to Dunkirk to commemorate the evacuation. The beaches of Dunkirk today are peaceful. Tourists walk where soldiers once waited in terror. Memorials dot the landscape. The Dunkirk Memorial commemorates the 4,504 members of the BEF who died in the fighting and have no known grave. In museums across Britain and France, artifacts from the evacuation are preserved: rusted helmets pulled from the sand, photographs of the little ships, testimonials from soldiers who were there. So what can we learn from Dunkirk nearly 85 years later? First, that even in the darkest moments, hope can emerge from unexpected places. Those civilian boat owners who crossed the channel weren't soldiers. They were fishermen, bankers, teachers, ordinary people who did extraordinary things when called upon. Second, that leadership matters. Admiral Ramsey's organization, Captain Tennant's quick thinking with the East Mole, the RAF pilots who fought against superior numbers, these acts of leadership saved an army. Third, that sometimes retreat is not defeat but survival. The military wisdom to recognize when evacuation is the only option, even when it means leaving equipment behind and admitting tactical defeat, can preserve the capacity to fight another day. And finally, that small decisions can have enormous consequences. Hitler's Halt Order, the favorable weather, the improvisation with the East Mole, any of these going differently could have changed the outcome completely. Dunkirk wasn't the end of World War II. It wasn't even the end of the beginning. But it prevented an end that would have been catastrophic for the Allied cause. In saving those 338,000 soldiers, Operation Dynamo ensured that Britain could continue fighting. And that fighting chance, that survival, eventually contributed to the liberation of Europe and the defeat of Nazi Germany. When Churchill spoke of fighting on the beaches, fighting on the landing grounds, fighting in the fields and in the streets, never surrendering, he could make those promises because Dunkirk had given Britain the army to back up those words. The miracle wasn't that everything went right. The miracle was that despite everything going wrong, despite disaster and defeat and desperation, enough went right to save an army. And in saving that army, they saved Britain's ability to fight on. From the little ships to the RAF fighters, from the soldiers waiting on the beaches to the planners in the tunnels beneath Dover, they all contributed to a moment when defeat was transformed into deliverance. That's the true miracle of Dunkirk. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of World War II's most dramatic moments, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more World War II documentaries. What aspect of the Dunkirk evacuation surprised you most? Let us know in the comments below. And remember, the story of World War II is filled with moments of courage, sacrifice, and determination. We'll continue exploring these stories, bringing you the human drama behind the historical events. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next documentary.